All right, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. Boelter and I are so excited to present our featured webinar, Food Service CapEx Planning, Top 5 Things Senior Living and Healthcare Operators Need to Consider. My name is Britt, and I'm very pleased to introduce our presenters today. So Aaron Fish, he's been here before, great guy, founder and CEO of Trestle Hospitality Concepts. Aaron has almost 30 years of hospitality and senior living experience, having worked for some top organization, and his focus is really in elevating the customer experience while helping operators develop best practices in areas of training, budget, operation, menu, you name it. Now, Nick Ellickson is actually the Director of Contract and Design in our Chicago office. He and his very talented team have designed and executed some of the most exciting food service projects in the city as well as across the country. Welcome, Nick and Aaron.
Thanks, Britt.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks for having us.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'm excited to have you guys here, and I'm excited that we're talking about CapEx planning. And I think that a good way to start is really talk about what is CapEx. So one of the things that we were talking earlier was really defining what that means. And when we look at CapEx, capital expenditures, it often refers to funds that a business spends to acquire, maintain, improve long-term assessments. So this form of company spending is considered an investment that adds economic benefit to operations through increased efficiency or capacity and so forth. And Aaron, I think you were the one that told me that long-term assets are usually fixed and non-consumable, but really, what does this mean in like layman's terms?
Yeah, so, that's a great kind of basic definition, but I think a lot of times people can kind of get confused about what are we really talking about? Obviously, there are some things that are just jump out and make sense, right? And these are probably the tangible assets when you think about a community or an operation. So things like machinery, land and buildings, equipment, vehicles, those are all like big ticket items that most everybody kind of lumps into that CapEx category. But something such as software, right? If you're purchasing a software package, that also falls into that capital expense because it does have that depreciable life. And then there's intangible assets too, things like licenses and patents. And so even something like an alcohol license, if that permit extends over the course of a few years, based on whatever the local jurisdiction says it does, then that could be considered a capital expense too. So there's a lot of different ways that it can be defined. One of the things that I think is really important is that there's not any sort of set metrics around that, right? So operators can kind of set their own guidelines when they do this, right? And that's great, because every business needs to manage themselves a little bit differently. And as long as they kind of fall in this line of depreciable assets, it makes sense, right? And so, some examples that I've worked with as an operator, I've worked for operators who have had high thresholds where it was maybe like $1,500 minimum, and then you had to have like a 3-year lifespan. Other operators I've worked for, I made it very, very small. So it was like a $500 minimum with only just a year of lifespan. So, and there's nothing wrong with either of those, right? So those are both examples of what it could be and what you can consider. So it really just is more of a business decision on your part. So, but the one thing that gets tricky is when you do establish those thresholds, things can get put into CapEx that maybe don't belong there. The good example of this that I always run into is thinking about china glass and silverware, right? Especially in the food service side. I've seen as an operator, people submit $3,000-$4,000 because they just haven't replaced anything and they want to capital expense that. Well, those items can be damaged or lost over a quick amount of time, right? Like within weeks or months even. And so that's not really a good example of a capital expense and probably shouldn't be. Whereas if you're getting a new fryer and that fryer is only in the $1,200, $1,500 range, that's clearly a much more acceptable use of capital expenses. And so the other thing I want to add is, I talk a lot about how operators need to have a profit mindset. And it's interesting, if you think about what public restaurants do, public restaurants that actually invest in capital the right way tend to have a much higher revenue growth compared to ones that don't. It's 11.9% versus 6%. And so you can see the same kind of returns in the senior living and healthcare spaces if you have that same approach. And so I know we want to talk about the top 5 things, and I know Nick and I are going to get into a lot of this, but I want to kind of briefly review them because these are things that are really important as you're developing your budgets, as you're figuring out what to make those expenses go towards. And so we're going to talk about the impacts of these capital decisions on your assets and your budgets, um, the input and decision making. What does that look like? Who's involved? The third topic is budget development factors, things that you want to consider as you're developing that budget. Fourth will be the process for identifying your needs. And then last, we'll kind of end on the prioritizing the needs versus the budget that you have and kind of what that looks like in general. So let's jump into the very first one. And so the very first thing is, what does the impact of these capital decisions look like? And honestly, you really need to start with being strategic about these investments, right? You want to think about how can these decisions have an impact on your property valuations? And we kind of break this down into 3 different areas, right? So the first is that value creation. Thinking about the engagement you're going to get from that investment with your residents, your patients, your staff, visitors that come into the location. These are all things that can improve that value and that engagement and kind of set you apart in the market. The other is the customer experience, right? And so this kind of ties in with engagement because especially as we're evolving in the senior living industry and the demographics are shifting, there's an expectation that comes with that. And so creating that value for an improved customer experience, while some of those decisions may not have a direct dollar impact, that customer experience will have a value impact to your marketing, your branding, and maybe even the overall value of your asset. The second thing to think about is revenue opportunities, right? And we're talking about using capital expenses and capital decisions to create streams of revenue that maybe aren't something that you would do. One example would be thinking about an empty space in your lobby and how can I take that from a food service perspective and make that space generate more revenue. So maybe I have a coffee shop or a sweet shop of some kind that residents and visitors can come to. And now I'm starting to generate an additional revenue stream by having something along those lines. And I know, Nick, you work with operators all the time and probably even have some other examples.
Yeah, no, actually, it's a great point. Britt and I actually are working with an account that, has taken their kitchen, understand that it has more potential, right? And some kitchens do and some don't. But they realize that they do have more capacity and they've got the team willing to try and do new things, put some marketing behind some new efforts. So, for example, there was a community that, had an extra space that kind of felt like a dead space. And they knew the kitchen could help serve it differently. They actually turned it into a restaurant. And so instead of it just being sort of a normal living room setting with some nice furniture, they created a pub concept where the public can actually come in and visit with the residents, their family, that are living at the community. And then it actually becomes a place that, now the residents want to go and hang out because there's more people and more action, but it actually is at their facility. We've also seen the kitchen turn into a catering option. And so instead of only serving the communities that are at their facility or the residents at their facility, they actually they've done some marketing locally to other businesses or different community parts of the community and done catering to those facilities. So just some creative ways that, if you've got the facility to do it, the team that's willing to do it, you can create new revenue streams, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, I always talk about that profit mindset, right? And if you think about that, you've created that revenue stream, but those examples you gave are perfect of engagement and customer experience. Like you took a what was probably a well-appointed living space, but that not really ever got used. And now it's just hopping with activity. There's things going on. There's money being spent, and so great example. The third point on here, when you think about those impacts on your property valuation and your overall asset, is the operational efficiencies, right? One of the things that I deal with some of the clients and customers I work with is renovations. People are looking at what they currently do. They were designed under an older, more institutional model, and they know that they've got to change and be more efficient with staffing shortages, with food costs the way they are. And so some of the things you can look at from this standpoint is technology, right? How can we spend capital to impact food service from a technology standpoint? Equipment or digital things that can support staff, right? We're always trying to figure out how we can improve the experience for the staff. And that's one way we can do that. And the other is the technology that's available, especially with, food service, on being able to create consistent products and that service be consistent and more resident and customer focused. And so those are definitely things that you can see and that will improve the overall impact of these capital decisions in the long run.
Yeah, and then the only thing I would add, because these are all really positive, great reasons to really focus on CapEx long term. But and I don't want to be the rain cloud on this slide, but the reality is there's a risk, right? Is if this stuff breaks down and you have an emergency, it's never fun. Scrambling to find food options or equipment options to feed residents is it can be kind of scary, intimidating, and it's not fun. So just another really good reason to kind of play offense as opposed to get caught on your heels.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And it kind of leads us into point number 2, right? And so this is the consideration of input and decision making, right? So this is the question of who needs to be involved and why, right? Because I think every operator, you guys probably see this all the time, where it's like we have some people who know what's going on, but we have other people who are signing the check and other people who are signing off on all of it. And so what does this look like, right? And so I want us to kind of touch a little bit on obstacles and considerations when you're figuring out what this looks like, right? And so the first obstacle that I kind of always see is the knowledge base of key decision makers, right? When you think about, my experience of being in the executive boardroom for some operators, some of them know what's going on in their back of house in their food service operations, and others just don't, right? They're relying on the people on the ground to kind of make it all happen. And so kind of having this, uncertain or this unknown knowledge base from those key decision makers can really be difficult, right? And I think what makes that hard is kind of this second thought of this lack of operational input, right? It's these decision makers that don't go to the front lines or go to the people who have a handle on what's happening in the operations on a day-to-day basis and not getting that input, right? If they get the feedback from that frontline staff, from the frontline directors of, hey, these are the issues we're dealing with, then those decision makers can actually come in and start making good, sound decisions and also figuring out, well, maybe we should pull some of these people in and sit at the table with us when we're talking about this.
Yeah, I would do that. So operationally, obviously very important. Got to have the chefs, got to have, the staff that's working in the facility, got to have the, whoever's controlling the budgets, got to have that. The one area that seems to be kind of forgotten sometimes is the maintenance department. And so we see it all the time. It's really important to make sure that the engineering of the building will support whatever the changes are that are happening. So a lot of times equipment's becoming more efficient. So do we need that same amount of power? Can we change the breaker? Do we have the gas? Do we have the steam pressure? All that stuff. We got to make sure that we're including the maintenance before we just make decisions. And then all of a sudden, the building's not supporting what we're putting in. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and it really is right in line with what we're talking about. I know that I always was like, hey, I need to go talk to my asset guy and see if they have everything under control and they can help me with this. But you're right. A lot of times they get left out. So the other piece of this that I think is important is, as people are growing, this senior living industry and healthcare, there is a lot of growth happening, right? And it's going to happen fast. Like if you're a small operator, like it's probably pretty easy to be able to get in and make those decisions, right? Like that person who's signing off on this can go into each of those first 2 or 3 locations that you're managing and make those decisions. Oh yeah, I see that. Sign off on it. But once you start scaling and getting larger and larger and larger, you really need to think about how you get accurate assessments and how you get good feedback from your on the ground frontline team. And that's why I think having a process and knowing who those decision makers need to be and kind of defining all of that is really important, especially when you think about growth.
Yeah, I would just to add a point to that. One thing we see with like chain restaurants, right? We know that this many locations got built over this number of years. And within that 5 to 10 year range, you're going to start seeing some issues in a certain piece of equipment. And so what we'll do often as kind of a service with the chain restaurants, but we've done it with some senior living facilities as well, is come up with a proactive replacement plan and say, okay, well, we know we're going to have issues with this item across all of our facilities because we're already starting to see service issues at each of them. Let's plan over the next 3 to 5 years, proactively starting to replace these. And again, go on the offense to get ahead of some of this stuff so we don't have major issues, that become emergencies down the road. And so we can come up with budgeting, we can come up with install plans that, this year we're going to replace these 5, the following year we replace these 5 and move down the road. So just something we do, in that planning area.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great consideration, right? And as you're doing that, right, I think it's important to really think about maybe if you're a 1 or 2 location operator, you don't need this, but as you're growing, as you're getting bigger, or if you are a good sized regional operator, maybe you need to have an actual like assigned team to develop out your capital plans. And, obviously it needs to have multiple disciplines involved. Like you don't want to make all these decisions with just the food and the finance people, right? You want to have operational people, want administration involved, you want maintenance involved. So I think that's really important in how you develop that team. And it can be a multi-tiered team, right? Like, so maybe there's a level for like initial ones, and then there's maybe a final decision-making group, but have a structure and define some clear processes and procedures and guidelines for that. Because I think if you do those things before you get too large or you get too big, it can make that growth and the management of your capital budgets as they go from 10 or 15,000 to 10 or 15 million, a whole lot easier to kind of get your arms around.
Yeah, I would add also find somebody to talk to, find an advisor, find somebody to be able to spitball those ideas off of, and make sure you're finding the equipment for the right application. Is this slicer appropriate for what I'm using it for? Is this oven appropriate for, this quantity or capacity? And so find somebody to talk to about that stuff. Ordering something like for like off the internet might not make sense. So find somebody that you can talk to, ask those questions. We can reach out to manufacturers to make sure that's the intended use of this new model before you kind of get too far down the road.
Yeah, that's a great point. Very good point.
So Aaron, we had a question come in. If how do I influence decisions if I'm not a decision maker in my community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what's important is that you be proactive and you really spend the time to try and build the business case for it, right? It's easy to say, oh, well, my oven's broken, I need to replace it, right? But if you've got a piece of equipment that is still working or but you see that it's probably going to happen, that it's going to either quit on you or it would be great to have a replacement, like put together all the information, build the business case. And then if your company has this capital process, make sure you know it and understand it, right? Don't just like, hey, here's the bid and submit it to your higher ups, right? Be deliberate about how you put together the information. So that way, when you're asked about it, you can answer the questions because you're going to get a lot of questions. Why, how, cost, all of those things are going to come in. So be ready to answer those for sure. So let's move on to number 3, right? And so let's start talking about things that need to be covered when you're developing your budget, right? And how do you determine your budget? And I think for our purposes here, there's really kind of like 3 big areas that we want to talk about. And these are probably mostly understood, but I think there's some nuance here that we want to kind of talk through and work through. And so obviously, planned renovations is something that we want to get into. And this is probably the easiest place to start, right, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, so planned renovations, again, that could include something where you're totally, redesigning a kitchen. I mean, that could be building out a new cafe, where there is a construction process included in that. We might need to get an architect involved. We've got tons of architects around the country that can help us with that. We want to make sure we're getting install quotes, or making sure that we're getting, the right fab, or if there's something custom, we want to make sure that we get all that stuff in line, get a budget price together, make sure that, we will talk a little bit later about the current conditions with price increases. And so, yeah, I mean, and that's something that happens it could take a year, it could take 2 years. That's a really long-term process. Again, making sure you have all the right key players as part of that decision is really important. And then budgeting for replacement. So that's going to be more simple one-off replacements. The important part about this that I don't want to underestimate is, let's say you've got a certain dish machine. We'll talk about dish machines a couple times throughout this PowerPoint, but let's say it's, if they've got to remove that, change the tabling, maybe there's a disposer that needs to get added, maybe there's plumbing that gets changed out. That could take a week. And so although it is one piece of equipment, the time that might take might be longer than expected. It might not be overnight, where the next day you walk in and you're ready to operate. So yeah, it's something where, again, being ahead of some of this and having the conversations, being aware, just knowing what might be involved in, if you're replacing a fryer, yeah, we can probably do that in a couple hours. But there are some other pieces of equipment that are a little bit more in depth. So, and then unexpected equipment failures, here's the rain cloud that we talked about earlier. Yep. But Aaron, I mean, this is really your, your area. We always get the calls from our end, but from your perspective, I mean, how do you deal with, these emergencies?
Yeah, it's really important to, you made some points about the time that machines and equipment can be down. And if you're planning for all of that, like, you can work that into the budget and know, hey, I'm probably going to spend a little bit more on food because we're going to be down a couple of days for this. But when you start getting into those unexpected failures, there's a lot that goes into what causes that. And we'll talk about it. But the big things for me is, what happens to your menus, right? Like, what are you going to have to do if you're down? And if it's last minute, those lead times may be significantly bigger or longer because you're not working with a partner to figure out what's happening.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the other piece of the puzzle is that owned versus leased, right? And so this is a big thing that a lot of people are like, well, I want to lease it so I can get it fixed and all of that. But there's a lot of downsides to leasing too. You got to make sure that it makes sense, that it's the right pieces of equipment. And a lot of times owning your own equipment can be better if the situation is right. And so, I think that's another thing to consider, because yeah, a leased machine, just because it's leased doesn't mean it's going to get fixed as fast as you think. It may take just as long, if not longer, for that repair to happen, versus if you're just completely owning it and replacing it yourself. There may be a shorter lead time for that. So some things to consider about the unexpected equipment failures that I think is important for the listeners.
Yeah, we actually, a few of our partners, and so the two areas that get leased the most often is ice machines and dish machines. Yep. Dish machines in particular obviously involve a ton of chemicals. And so some of our manufacturers actually have provided calculators where we can plug in the information. How long are you using it? What type of machine is it? How many hours is it running a day? And come out with, a rental versus own, and you can even do lease to own if you want, where you're still making payments and it's not a big chunk, but we can do a calculator. If you plan to be open for longer than 5-6 years, which most senior living facilities are, we would always recommend, buying that, because over, again, 4 or 5 years, you get to this breaking point where you're spending a ton of money on chemicals, as well as water and energy. We understand sometimes if you got a VE project, right? Those are the first couple areas you might point to. Once those contracts are up, it might be time to consider buying something. But we can lay all that out and you can make the decision on it. It's just, there are some resources and calculators and stuff out there to help make the decision. So
Yeah, the calculator resources are great to be able to, that lets you get into how much money should we set aside? How can we plan for this? And maybe it's a mixed bag of, I'm going to do a lease here, but then in the future I should plan on buying and owning because of costs and everything involved. So
yeah.
Great point. So the next thing is, like, we've kind of talked a little bit about like the different areas of the budget, but how do we actually like create these budgets, right? Like there's so many things that go into that. And so obviously I think the first thing to consider is like the equipment and design market conditions. Everything is all over the board with this nowadays. And like you said, Nick, you're going to go into some of this for us. But we really want to think about, like, what does that look like? Where are we at with all of that? What resources who are we talking to as we're doing that? The next is thinking about that community profitability and that return on investment, right? And so, one of the things we always struggle with in senior living is the market good? Is the community performing well? Is our census where we want it to be? And that having those additional dollars that can be moved towards capital expense is important, right? Some small operators, they have to count on monies from that community coming in to be used for capital the next year, right? And so if it's not a high NOI community, there's going to be a smaller budget. And so it's really important to think about that. And so maybe we look at value pieces of equipment, or we look at what are the actual benchmarks that we can use for that. So I think thinking that about those communities, the profitability, that return on investment you're going to get for this capital is really going to be important. So, and I think the third point here is thinking about those efficiencies and service impacts that we were kind of touching on before. I think that's a really important thing to also look at when you're creating your budget.
So Aaron, when we're talking about capital planning, how can capital planning be used to impact staff retention and workflow efficiency?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been talking all year about staffing and labor challenges and what are we going to do with that? And so, the goal should be behind any capital layout or any capital plan is that you're not making it harder for the staff, right? And if you can use your capital budget to improve workflow efficiency, or are you creating spaces for the staff? I've seen operators who, when they're building new communities, they don't even invest in a break room, right? They're just like, wow, we don't want them hiding out in there. But that's not necessarily a smart decision, right? So maybe converting spaces to be more employee facing. There's even revenue opportunities with that. So I think there's some good opportunities there to really consider, what are we doing? What's the overall impact for our employees? And then thinking about improving community marketability, right? Once you start improving the marketability of your community, that's going to increase your brand awareness, increase what you're doing. And if you move from that institutional model to a more restaurant, a la minute cooking model, now you have a different sort of staff and culinarian looking to come work for you. So there's a number of ways that looking at how your capital budgets can be built can impact that staff and retention and that workflow efficiency. So Nick, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I wanted you to kind of go in a little bit deeper about understanding and managing equipment life cycles, because I think, at least from my experience as an operator, I don't think we always understand this and have a good grasp on the different types and how it's all managed. So I'd love to get some of your insights on why this is so important and valuable.
Yeah, we get asked all the time, how long do we expect this piece of equipment to last? Why is this seem like it's having service issues and it's only 3 or 4 years old. And so we get asked that stuff all the time. We just threw some numbers up, kind of estimated in the senior living space, what we'd kind of expect to see, some life cycles for pieces of equipment. Normally right off the bat, anything that involves water. So you're going to see your ice machines, your dish machines, your steamers. Water's really harsh on pieces of equipment. And so, number one, preventive maintenance. You got to change the oil on your car. You got to take care of this equipment as well. It has a ton of components in there. Water's harsh on it. You got to delime it. You got to take care of this stuff. So if it's refrigeration, clean the condensers. And so each of these pieces of item have those preventive maintenance items in there. If you're not taking care of it, of course it's going to break down. You should see how many components go into a combi oven. It's honestly unbelievable. So we need to make sure we're taking care of that. That'll absolutely extend the life cycle of a piece of equipment. The second thing is looking at operational volumes. And so how busy is this kitchen? I mean, are you guys making food all day, every day, and you're feeding hundreds of residents across an entire campus? Or is this a smaller facility and you've got 3 square meals a day and we're not running this thing into the ground? And so operational volumes is absolutely something we pay attention to. And then really quality of equipment. And that ranges, right? I can buy a refrigerator for $2,000 and I can buy that same, actually not the same, an equal size refrigerator that could be $10,000. The difference is the components that make it, right? And so what is that refrigeration package? What is it made of? What kind of structural reinforcement is it built with? And so the quality of that equipment is not all equal. Even though it's a 2-door refrigerator, it's not the same as every 2-door refrigerator out there. So something we pay attention to. It absolutely is going to impact that life cycle. And so there's absolutely an ROI on, spending the money up front to let it last longer. Or maybe your facility's in a different place where, in 2 years, we plan on renovating this whole kitchen. Okay, well, let's get you something that's going to get you by for the next 2 years, right? We don't need the top of the line piece of equipment. Let's just get you by for the next couple of years. And then when we do that full renovation, we can talk about, what we really want to put in there long term.
Yeah, that short-term versus long-term purchasing is such a key thing for operators to consider. I think back to the community profitability note on the last slide, right? And we have the opportunity for some of these communities to be able to purchase something and maybe it's not, like you said, top of the line, but it's going to get you through and let you work on increasing census and profitability of the location and get you through short term. It's not always a bad thing from an operator's perspective to replace something every 3 years at a cost of $3,000 when maybe you could get something that lasts you for 8 years at $10,000 or $12,000, right? Like there's a balance to that, and it has to be considered. And that's why having industry partners like Boelter is so important to be able to reach out and say, hey, here's my conundrum, here are my issues. Help me kind of walk through why I should look at these things.
So we do have a question from the audience before we jump in ahead. Is staffing changes so frequently now? So how do you plan, the proper piece of equipment for the future, not being able to predict future skill set?
Wow, that's a great question. I'll take a stab at it first, Nick. I would say it depends on your staffing model, right? Like if you're doing, if you're a smaller operation, you might want to look at something that is more programmable. We talked about technology for staffing efficiencies, right? This is something you can look at. There are plenty of pieces of equipment out there that can be programmed. You can build recipes in it, and the great thing is that manufacturers and equipment providers can help you do all of that work. We switched over a lot of our steamers to programmable combi ovens for that reason. We had a lot of communities with small staff sizes And so once you start programming those recipes in, then the training is, hey, we're doing recipe A, it's this button, and this time. Or maybe it's all programmed and you just press the button. So that's definitely something to think about when you're doing that. And hopefully you've got a good training program in place to begin with. There's a lot of things that go into that onboarding.
Yeah, I would, Carolyn, that's a great question. I would probably add, mainly because of our experience with this. I'm not an operator expert like Aaron is, and so he's going to have some of that touch on it. But at least from our perspective, our manufacturers are doing everything they can to help with labor and to help with automation. It's not just senior living, it's kitchens everywhere, right? Every restaurant, every operator out there is struggling with retention. I would say investing in your facility and making it easier to work with, helps a little bit, some of these dish machines have some self-cleaning features. Well, that helps because I don't have to go through and do all that stuff, right? You talk about the ovens that Aaron was referring to, some of that automation to really clean some of that stuff up and not have to struggle through, turning the pans and doing all that stuff it all helps. But I just know from our perspective, the manufacturers are constantly worried about energy efficiency and labor savings. Those are really the two hot buttons right now. I know Britt, we've got, Britt's been looking at a ton of different technologies and robotics and stuff like that we've been doing a lot of research on, and we're starting to see adapted in certain places, not necessarily to replace the workers, but to assist the workers, right? And that gives us a little bit more flexibility around those spaces. So not a perfect answer, but at least from our world in the equipment category, I know there's a lot of investment going into the manufacturers to do that.
Yeah, it's a great resource, especially for an operator who needs training help. They'll do it for no cost to their equipment. So definitely. So let's jump into number 4, right? So process for identifying needs. And so you need to think about, what are you considering as you create your process for this, right? And so, the first thing I think you really need to understand in this whole entire capital process is, what are you doing to understand, manage your equipment maintenance? Nick has talked about it a little bit already. But as an operator, I think it's really important that you spend time and really take a good long look at, what are you investing as far as management tools and systems from a maintenance perspective, right? If we talked about, Britt had a question from someone earlier about, well, how can you make the right influence on decision makers? And this is where the rubber meets the road on that. If you've got good tools, if you've got good systems to be able to track your repairs, track your ongoing maintenance, right? This is going to be super, super helpful, because now you understand where in that life cycle of the equipment that you're really at, right? Like, is it something you're spending a lot of time and money and energy on, or is it something that's just humming along, right? And so, it's really important to have that. And the reason is that now you've got data on the life of this piece of equipment. And there's so many different pieces of equipment in a food service operation that it can get overwhelming. But without that data, you can't start really making really sound decisions. You can't, as the higher up in the organization you go, you're not able to share data and make smart decisions, because you're going to have a budget one way or the other. And so it's really important to kind of get in there and understand, what does that look like? What are we doing for maintenance and repairs? We track all of that. And where's that information?
Yeah, that next topic, you talk about fixing or replacing, and I think there was an article by one of our partners, I think it was Middleby, that I think they put on their blog, and they did a great job kind of talking through that decision. It's like, how many times am I going to keep fixing this before I just replace it? And so there's one of the points they made that I really love focusing on: safety. right? I mean,
Yeah.
it has to be the priority for operators to make sure that their employees are safe. You know, if that fryer tank is leaking oil and it's something they can slip on, or if there's a chance that you know, a fire can get started over here, or you know, is the slicer's blade, you know, is that something that they're at risk for? So there's all kind, everybody knows how dangerous some of these kitchens can be. Focusing on safety and making sure that the equipment is up, running in a safe manner, obviously should be number one priority. And then you talk about performance, right? So is the recovery time of this fryer recovering fast enough to keep up with the operation? Is the tank temperatures of this dish machine holding temp? And so you can go down every piece of equipment, right? But the performance of that, will be here all day. Sorry. But the performance of that equipment is obviously something that we really need to pay attention to. If it's not keeping up and performing to your needs, then you need to think about replacing it. And then really that repair versus fix. You know, at some point you're going to have to repair it. And so you need to get a budget. How much does it take to replace it? And if it's a big expense and it's a small replacement, maybe you can handle that a few times. But depending on what that's connected to and what that's leading to, you get a pretty clear picture that this is going to go down in the next year or so. So having a budget of what it costs up front and then monitoring those different repairs is really important. So, and then the third point's obviously warranties.
Well,
you know,
I'm going to
what's
stop you
that?
before that, Nick. So we have a
Yeah,
question from the audience before we jump
yeah.
into warranties. Actually for you too, Aaron, is which
Yeah.
software is good to track these things? So if we're looking at tracking repairs and costs associated with that, what's a software suggestion that you recommend?
So there are a number of tools out there that track maintenance and work orders. And I don't have a personal preference on any of them, right? You know, I know that there's Tells is one system that's really popular, but what I think is more important isn't so much the software, but it's the process you use, right? And so I'm always a big proponent of any software system that will allow you to quickly get a work order or a piece of data collected. That's the first place to start, right? And so, you know, I worked with an operator to put QR codes on all of our equipment, right? You would QR code it, give it an item number or an equipment number, then you train your staff on how to use that software, right? And so they can take a shot of the QR code, put a note in like, this is what's wrong with it, this is who it goes to, and then make sure that it's connected to people who can get constant updates on that. And so, you know, there's a lot of different options with software, but I think what's more important is how efficient and how friendly it is for staff to use, because it can be a really great, robust back end system, but if it's bulky for staff to use, we're not going to get used and you're not going to collect what you need.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't have a ton to add on that point. To be honest with you, you know, from our perspective, so many of these replacements are unique and have their own different quirks to them. So I don't know that there's a one size fits all that I'm aware of on you know, tracking you know, all of this stuff. I know that Middleby actually has a software called Open Kitchen, I think it is, and so that's really focused on IoT. And so that's a big direction for the industry right now that this equipment is headed. You know, everybody wants to be connected. How many cycles has it run? Is it hitting temperatures? How many hours is it running a day? How many hours does it run over its life? And so we're going to get better and better at tracking that information. I know all these manufacturers are paying attention to that IoT direction. Again, I've mentioned Middleby a few times, and I know that they've got that Open Kitchen software. They're opening that up to other manufacturers as well. And so if that's a direction you want to go, we can talk to them and make sure they would open that up to different manufacturers. So if there's any software out there that's blocking somebody from, you know, connecting multiple softwares, we need to have that conversation too, because it shouldn't be happening. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it kind of that leads into this warranty conversation we were going to have, right? Because, having the software and a good place to track warranties is useful, right? But I think, at least from my perspective, warranties have a place in the process, but they're not always necessary, right? And so, I think when you think about warranties, there have been times when I've looked at it and been kind of making the assessment of, well, maybe if I buy this piece of equipment that's a lower cost, but add a warranty, I might be able to get more bang for my dollar that way versus just buying that higher end piece of equipment. But then there have been times where warranties made no sense and it was just a complete waste of money. And so it really comes down to that cost benefit analysis when you're evaluating a warranty. And so, Nick, I know you have some thoughts on this. I just know that for me, from an operator's perspective, that's how I look at warranty and using that.
Yeah, I really just think it's something we should pay attention to. I don't think, again, it's end all be all, but I do think that it's worth paying attention to. I know a lot of the refrigeration companies over the last 10 years have really upped their warranty from 1 year to 3 years, and the compressor's 5 now, and now somebody's at 7. And so it seems like there's a big chase with warranties. And so I know it's just something to pay attention to. That a lot of times there is some sort of maintenance issue along the way. And if they're covering it for this many years, that's part of the cost. And then you go down the VE path as well, and some of that stuff is going to get less expensive. Well, the warranty is part of that as well. So that's all I probably would add to that.
Yeah, no, definitely. So let's hit number 5, because I think this one is probably, the hardest, because now we're talking about prioritizing. What are our needs? What's our budget? How do we compare the two? And like, where do we even begin, right? And so every time I have a presentation, right, I always find a quote that kind of, for me, hits home on the topic. And I think this one does, right? We're always concerned about the dollars, right? And that's the resource, but it's not always about those resources. It's about the resourcefulness, right? And so thinking about how do you maximize all of the resources outside of dollars and cents. And so I think it's important to think about, from an operator's perspective, who can I tap into to help me with this, right? When I was making capital budgets and capital decisions and trying to, get those built, I initially would go online and I'd start looking at pieces of equipment and what's the cost. And the next thing I know, I spent 3 or 4 hours going down a rabbit hole of trying to figure it out. When I got a little bit smarter and wiser and a little more seasoned in my career, I realized, I should pick up the phone and call Nick, right? Because he does this every single day, and he has all the resources and all the manufacturers on speed dial. Like, I can tell him what I'm looking for and what I need, and now I have that untapped knowledge at my fingertips, and I can go do more important things, quote unquote, as an operator by doing that. And so, considering your team's knowledge is also important, but I think using those outside resources of your team, their experience, and who are your partners out in the industry that can help you.
Yeah, I just to echo that. I mean, it seems like I run into operators kind of all over the place that get in this kind of this bind where they're like, where do I even begin? What do I even, how do I even start? It's like, yeah. I've got teams of people looking at different technology and looking for different installers, and and our supply chain analysts are working on deals for operators. And so, I just find somebody, reach out. I know Britt does an amazing job, not to pump her tires up too much on this, but but I know she does this amazing job with so many accounts that I'm listening in on, and how she helps manage them. And they'll be like, hey, have you ever heard of something like this? And honestly, no, but within a week, we've got a lot of answers and a lot of different information that we can analyze together and think about if that's what's best for your facility. So, I mean, having somebody to talk to, throw ideas at, I think is just really important. And don't be intimidated. I mean, there's always a process. There's always a first step. And really just starting to have the conversations is the easiest part. So
I got very adept at being able to say, I've got this great vision for what we can do. And then I would just pick up the phone and be like, okay, so hear me out. This is what I'm trying to do. And I think if
Yeah.
we do ABC or get these 3 pieces of equipment, I think we can do it. Now tell me what your thoughts are. And it goes more in depth than just the, hey, I need you to evaluate these 3 different pieces of equipment for me. It can really get into that actual design, that programming, the actual concept development, if you've got the right partners and the right relationship built. So I think that's really valuable.
Yep. Totally
So,
agree.
so let's dive into the market, right? And so I'm just going to say this because you guys are the experts when it comes to what you're dealing with. But as an operator, I know what we're dealing with food costs and supply chain. I know what the last 3 almost years now have been like with all of that. And so I know that some things have gotten better, but we haven't seen all of that. And so it'd be great for you guys to give us, where are we at right now? What are things we need to consider? And kind of walk us through some of that right now.
Britt, you want to, it seems like you're in this conversation quite a bit. You want to jump in here?
Yeah, I definitely will. One thing that I do want to say, not sure why I'm echoing,
Let's,
is we do have another question that I will definitely ask. So Sean, I will ask your question. What I wanted to just kind of quickly touch upon is like what we're seeing now versus pre-COVID, right? And I think that we're fortunate because this is what we do every day. So we see it much more clearly than some of our operators. Nick touched upon lead times, right? Those lead times have been insane at the beginning of the year, and we are seeing improvements. There's still some manufacturers and some products that it's still insane. So that's something that we hope we see it improving. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be as great as it was pre-COVID, right? Multiple price increases, and we're talking at least 1, 2. And so one of the things that we're always looking for is just solutions to our customers, because while we do see improvement, we do not expect to see as many price increases and as high of a price increase, like the double digits that we saw this year. We know that they're coming, right? Every manufacturer does have price increases at the beginning of the year. So, we're doing our best to forecast, and we really track that information as well. So we can, I'll be happy to share that. Supply chain issues. Oh my God, are we tired of hearing about supply chain issues? But I mean, that's still something that again is getting better, but it's not great. And tie that into the labor market, right? So now you have manufacture. We're seeing unskilled workers, right? There's a labor shortage, and the labor that we have coming into our manufacturing maybe is not as skilled as what we've had before. So there tend to be a little bit more in terms of part failures than we've seen. But even like truck drivers and deliveries and delays of that. Service calls. I mean, service calls is probably something that unfortunately Nick and I see on a regular basis. But what we found is that service calls these days, it's taken a lot longer to get someone out to fix a piece of equipment or install a piece of equipment. We had one situation in California where it was like 6 weeks to install a unit. And, when we think about labor shortages, like it's bad enough in our communities, but there's like a bigger impact. Like if you have service agents and they're shorthanded, there's really such a high demand that's something, that we're really not seeing. So like, what are the solutions? That's what we're working towards. Like, what are the solutions?
Yeah, I think, there's a project Nick and I have been working on where this comes into play for us to be able to work together with operator and consultant and equipment vendors to understand what to do, right? So one of my clients, we're doing a kitchen design project, and I needed help with hood design and getting the right hood because it's a smaller kitchen. And so, I reached out to Nick and I said, hey, Nick, it feels like there's not a lot of options here when it comes to hood. We need to get a design done kind of quick because it's a short turnaround. And so I reached out and said, Nick, what can we do here? And the solutions that came up were great. I was surprised with what happened in that project.
Yeah, this is, to your point, Britt, I think the supply chain issues have really exposed a lot of our partners. And so you can see the ones who are really willing to step up. find a way to make it work, find a way to come up with a solution depending on the application. And you know, a lot of these partnerships have either sank or swim, I guess is a way to say it. And so we came up with a different hood, full HVAC package that was going to meet the deadline and meet the budget. And again, it's nice to be able to have options and as well as partners that can help save us sometimes. So.
Okay, so on that, I do have one more question I want to ask is from the audience. The question is, I run into a lot of refrigeration equipment changeouts that I move from remote compressor to self-contained, excluding walk-ins, of course. Also, built-in units that fail and need either complete rebuild versus removing and replacing to modular. For example, deli prep tables. What are your thoughts on this type of replacement?
So I'll tackle the built-ins versus modular question because I have a very strong opinion on this. I refuse to design any new kitchens that have any sort of built-ins. The idea that you would do that in my mind seems crazy, right? Because what happens is I'll use a steam table. This is a real world example. And this was an existing community that I took over management of. And we had one steam well out of 5 quit. And so we got a service company in there. They looked at it all. They did a quote. And for that specific project, it was a $2,000 replacement for one steam well. When I went to my vendor partner and said, what does this look like if I were to just take this whole thing out, literally pull out the entire chef's table and replace it with all of the other modular pieces around it and rebuild the whole entire expo line, it cost me about $800 more in total. And then the longer term value of that was being able to, well, if this piece of equipment goes out, well, now I don't have to do all this over again. I'm just replacing that one item. And so now I've did a little mini renovation, but it wound up saving me in the long run from headache and heartache of equipment being down and long-term repairs and replacement, because now I have an easier, more modular process in place for replacement. So that's my own personal take on that.
I'll take the first half of the question then, because you took the second half. But Sean, it's a really good question. We see it a lot. We do installs both ways. Obviously, when you're remoting, you know, a rack or refrigeration rack, you're going to be saving a little bit of noise in the kitchen. So if you want to bring the noise down, that's one thing. The heat is another piece that's really important to think about. So if it's a tight kitchen and the living room's right out, you know, right around the corner, think about some of that stuff. The HVAC in the room is something to be thinking about. The equipment should perform the same. So it should not be a situation where you're saying, well, this just performs better than this. The equipment should be performing the same or close to the same. It sounds like you've got more than just your walk-ins on these remote refrigeration racks. And in some cases, you might have 2 and 3 and 5 pieces around the kitchen on a rack. One thing to maybe think about is, you know, redundancy. If that rack goes down on the roof or there's a leak in that line, that whole system could have a problem. And so now all of your refrigeration in that kitchen could have issues. So just thinking about, do you need redundancy on that rack is one part of it. And then it really just depends on the rest of that operation as well. But I'd be thinking about size and HVAC and noise. Again, performance should be about the same. You shouldn't see big differences holding temperatures with that. So.
Yeah, great question, Sean. Thank you. So let's kind of hit here the home stretch, right? So the last thing in prioritizing needs versus budget, emergency needs and contingency planning, right? And so, you know, there's so many different ways to look at this. And some people will say, oh, well, you should just plug in a percentage. We want to do a 10% or a 15% contingency budget just for stuff that breaks. And you know, the one thing I will say about that is, you know, your planning is done annually, but these kinds of issues are going to appear daily. And I think if you go back to tracking your maintenance and your repairs and you have a good data set of what is actually going on in each and every kitchen and each and every food service outlet that you have, you can really look back historically and say, you know what, I know that last year we budgeted 10%, but it looks like this year we had a few more failures. maybe we need to do 12 or do 15. And so I think thinking about looking historically at what you've spent and considering all of that when you do that contingency planning is really, really important.
Well, that
Go
was
ahead.
amazing. And I just want to jump in because we are out of time, unfortunately, and we've had such great conversation and such wonderful questions. So thank you both for your input, Aaron and Nick, and thank you to our attendees. We have our contact information on the screen. A quick reminder that Aaron's company, Trestle Hospitality, does work with owners, operators across the country and really brings their operations to the next level by understanding the impact of every aspect of customer interaction. And of course, Boelter, keep us in mind when no one knows food service like we know food service, from design, renovations, kitchen equipment, tabletop, smallwares. Let us pursue your passion. Contact us today. So we will be sending the presentation to registered attendees and also welcome any feedback and suggestions for future topics. And we'll see you in January with our next webinar. So more to come, but thank you all for joining us today. And of course, please reach out if you have any questions or want to have further discussion on what we talked about. We welcome it. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.